Hey everyone, and welcome to part 16 of the Godot top-down shooter tutorial. In this video, we are going to cover adding a tile map to your game so we no longer have this gray background for our game. Plus, we're going to focus on how to add collision shapes to parts of your tile map so that our player and bullets and whatever else collide with walls and buildings that we add to our game. So we'll be going over all the different ways to use a tile map, all the different types of tiles you can create, and this is just going to be a general basic overview of how to use tile maps within Godot. So hope you're excited, and with that, let's get started. So as a note, as we get into this tutorial, I'm going to do my best to give you an overview of how to use a tile map in Godot so that if you've never used it before, you should feel comfortable to start using it in your game. But tile maps are a pretty complex subject. There's a lot of things that you can do with them and a lot of features that aren't easy to just cover right away. So it'll be good if you're still curious or feel like there's more you want to know to look at other tutorials or look online for more resources about how to use tile maps. That said, let's get started. So if I come over to our main scene here, I'm going to first create a new node, and I'm going to call this, or I'm going to search for tile map. And so a tile map is the default container for all tile maps and tile sets in Godot. You always need a tile map, at least one, when you want to use tile sets. And so there's a lot of things you'll see once we create our tile map here. First, I'm going to call this ground. And typically the way that I use tile maps, and this isn't a hard and fast rule, you can adjust as needed, and different games are going to have different needs, but I will usually have a ground tile map where I just put a default ground layer. I'll then have another tile map that I call ground overlay or ground decorations, and this is where I'll put dirt and flowers and some other things just to give a bit more variety. And then if I have things like walls or trees or other things, I will typically have another tile map layer where those things are housed. So the first thing we're going to do just as a tile map tutorial is make our ground. So when I create our tile map, you'll see a couple things over here. You'll see a mode, which is square. Whenever you're doing traditional 2D, you want to use square. Isometric is when you want a 2.5D, kind of an isometric feel to your game. We don't have isometric tiles, so we are just going to use square. We'll see tile set empty. So this is a resource we're going to create in just a minute. And then you'll see a couple other options here. We don't need to worry about those. We do want to worry about cell. So we'll come back to this in just a second. Then there's collision, occluder. So one of the cool things about tile maps in Godot is that they have built-in support for collisions and for light occlusion. So you can add shadows and collision shapes to your tile map just by default, which is a really awesome feature about Godot. So let's get started actually making our tiles. First thing I'm going to do is click this empty tile set and say new tile set. And then it'll create a new tile set resource, and I'll click on that, and then we will see the tile set editor pop up here. And this is going to look really familiar to, the animation editor or the animated sprite editor. It's just kind of the standard Godot sub editor. So we need to actually add in a sprite or a tile sheet to use as our tile set. So I'm going to hit this plus button here, which will let me select what we want to use. You can see I've already got it open over here. We're going to go to assets, top-down shooter, tile sheet. And by the way, if you've got the Kenny pack, make sure you use tile sheet and not sprite sheet. The sprite sheet has space in between all of them, but the tile sheet, they're all packed together. So that's what we want to use. I'll just use the tile sheet complete. And then you'll notice that we've got the tile sheet visible down here. Now, there's a lot of extra options you can get with this, but in order to access them, you have to actually create a tile. So let's kind of go over this interface for a second and talk about what all the options are. So you've got your, zoom in, zoom out buttons here. You've got tile info you can toggle on or off. I like to keep that on. And you've got 3 buttons up here that let you create new tiles. So I'll give a brief overview of each one, and then we're going to actually go through and give an example. So new single tile creates a placeable tile out of something in this grid. So if you just have one, like a unique one-off tile you want to make. So if we come down here, we'll see this toaster, right? Say we want to place a toaster in our game. Well, we can create a new single tile and select right here to have a toaster tile. Now, one thing you'll notice is that I have to manually drag and select, which we don't want to do, right? Like our tile set here, our tile sheet is all uniform size. So we know what size our tiles are, and we want to get some snapping to this. So now that I've created a tile, you'll see there's some extra options that pop open. I'm not totally sure why these aren't there by default, but sometimes you just need to create a tile for these to show up. So I'm going to hit enable snap and show grid, and all of a sudden you'll see a grid here. And now if I drag, it'll snap to the grid, which is what we want. So you'll notice that our tiles are like half the size we want it to be. This toaster should be 1 tile, but it's currently 4, if you can see these little blue lines here. So in order to change that, I'm going to come over here to our right where there's some new things that have opened up, some new options. I'm going to select snap options and change this to be 16. So this, oh, whoops, nope, take that back, 64. I was thinking the wrong way. Okay, so this tile set from Kenny is all 64 pixel tiles, both ways. So now that it's 64, you'll see that each unique square here of our tile set is an individual tile. So if I select this toaster, it'll just select the whole thing. So you can use the step here to make your grid fit your tiles. Now, say you had some space between each tile. So there was, like a 1 or 2 pixel margin in between each tile. You can use separation here to account for that. So it'll space out your grid tiles by like accounting for space in between them. So Godot tries to give you a lot of options to work with different tile sets. Personally, I have had issues in the past, even with separation, trying to get tiles to work that have space between them. So I always prefer to use tiles that are packed together, that do not have space between each individual tile or image on the tile sheet. Then there's some options for the selected tile here. So say I want to give this tile a name. I can call this toaster. So now it's got a name. You can modulate this specific tile. It won't change what it looks like here, but when you actually place that tile in your game, this modulate property will be applied to it. I'm gonna reset that. And there's some other offsets, z-index things you can do here. So just an overview, this is how you create a tile. Now, single tiles are great, but when you're making a game map, you don't want to place every single tile by hand. That's really difficult, it takes a lot of time, and it just kind of gets rid of the value of using a tile map. So next we're going to look at autotiles, which are one of the more complex features of tile maps, but also probably the most useful as far as making a map for your game. Okay, so in order to demonstrate how we use autotiles, I'm going to scroll over and find just our generic wooden building tiles. So you'll see all this set of tiles in here that kind of have a wood exterior with kind of this darker gray interior. And so what I'm going to do here, similar to what we did with the single tile, is I'm going to click new auto tile, and then I'm going to drag throughout this entire region. And even though we're probably not going to use some of these tiles, that's totally fine. We will just include them anyway. And so now that we have this selected, I'll change this name to be, we'll say wood building. One other thing to note too, this is what I mentioned, I do recommend having this display tile names info icon on, because now we can see if I have this on, this wood building tile as well as our toaster, but if I turn it off, you can see the outline, but it's not totally clear just where our tiles are. So the tile editor, the tile set editor in Godot, this UI is perfectly usable, and I pretty much use it in all of my games that do have a tile map. But there's still some finicky things about it. One thing to know is that if you click off, like if I have this wood building selected, right, and I click off somewhere else, like it can change where my tile, my auto tile is, or where my current tile set is. So we've just lost this whole wooden building thing over here. It's just moving where I click. So just be careful with that. And if you do click off where you want your tile to be, that is totally fine. You can just reselect it. So all that say, now we have our wooden building here and it's selected. So if I go over to my ground tile map here, we'll see a couple things. One is we have our toaster, which is great. I can select and place toasters wherever I want, which is, again, the most important thing that our game could have. But if I have our wooden building and I place it, it just always places the top, like a top left corner tile. It doesn't ever place the right tile. So we need to define some rules that tell our tile map which wooden building tile to place based on which tiles are around it. So if I get rid of this, we can come back into our tile set here. click on our tile sheet, and start defining some of those rules. And the way we do that is through something called a bit mask. And so a bit mask basically lets you draw which parts of a tile should be drawn depending on what other tiles of the same type are around it. So basically it's saying, hey, if I know that I have a wall on the tile above me, I should not draw a wall. I should not draw a tile that has a wall at the top. So if we have this tile right here that I just clicked on, then and I put a tile to the right, like I should not draw a tile like this because I know that we have the same tile or a tile of the same tile set to the left. So you're basically defining those rules, and Godot will use that to paint in the correct tile. So with a bit mask, what it lets you do is click on different parts of a tile to draw in what you want to think about it as where someone should be able to walk, like where the collision should be. That's not always the right way to think about it, but in this case, like I want so look at this like little corner or centerpiece here. If I am a actor in our game, like the player or an enemy, I want to be able to walk here and here and here and here and here and here and here, but I should not be able to walk in the middle here. And when you do that, you're basically defining the rules of where that tile will get drawn in juxtaposition to other tiles in the same tile set. So if I were to follow that same pattern, I'd click here for this one, and I click up here for this. And you'll notice that this isn't super correct. Like right now, I can draw 4 bit mask little squares within a tile, like if I click on 4 different corners. But our tile set isn't that small. Like we have a lot of little intricacies here. So I'd really like to not draw these 2 corners, but be able to click in the middle here for this one. So Godot lets you do that, and you can actually change the size of your bit mask, like squares that you draw. Also, one thing, it's left click to draw these and right click to get rid of them. So what I need to do is change our auto tile bit mask, these options over here under selected tile, change this to be 3x3, 3x3 minimal. 3x3 gives you, is basically you draw the same way as 3x3 minimal, but you get a little bit more control over how those tiles are grown, but it requires a lot more tiles in your tile set to actually draw correctly. So typically, unless you have a huge tile set, I think it's 256 tiles or something crazy like that, that cover every single option, like every possible permutation, you usually want to do 3x3 minimal. So if I select 3x3 minimal and now try to draw on our tile set, we'll see that I can select three different sections, 3 different squares in each direction for our auto tile, which gives me a lot more fine-grained control, because now I can say I should be able to walk in every part of this except this little corner. And I can do the same down here and just draw on through here. Okay, and I'm not going to do all these, but I do want to draw just enough to give you a demo. One thing you want to do too is find the default square. I think there's one in here somewhere. Is it this one? It might be this one. Okay, I'll just do that. Oh no, it's this one right here. Okay, so just find the like the default, like this is a single tile. There's nothing adjacent to it. And before we go on with this, one other thing you can do is select the icon tile. And this is basically selecting the tile that represents the entire tile set. So it's the tile that when you look here will show up in the actual tile map editor. And so for us, like I usually select this option here, like whichever one is the self-contained tile that has a border on each side, just so it's clear like what tile this is. And this becomes the default tile that Autotile will draw if nothing else matches the bit mask, if it can't find the correct bit mask. So anyway, let me just go through, and I'm just going to draw the bit mask through a bunch of these tiles, and then we'll see it working. I won't speed it up because I'm just going to try and do this quickly. Hopefully it makes sense how I'm choosing which areas to draw the bit mask. Like I said, a very simple way to think about it, which is usually correct, is just think about it where someone should be able to walk. You basically want to, you can draw it either way. Like you can draw your red wherever your walls are, or you can draw them wherever the walls are not, but just make sure it's consistent. Here I'm choosing to draw it where walls are not. So whenever there is a third like a small section that does not contain a wall part of our tile set, that is where I'm going to draw our bit mask here. So let me just draw these, and I think this should be all we need. So one thing to note too is that working with tile maps is kind of tedious. There's really not a way around it. It does take time and effort to get this, and it's not just Godot. It's really that way in every other program or game engine that works with tile maps. They just take some work. It takes a little bit of setting up to get correct. So if you're a little discouraged about how long it's taking, do not fret. It's just natural. It's part of working with tile maps, so it just takes some time to get used to. And I think we've drawn everything we need to. One other thing to note is that you usually don't want to use all the tiles in a tile set. Like, some extra will come. So for example, here we already have our tile, which is just self-contained, that has no borders. We could do the same thing here and draw on these, but we don't really want to use those in our game right now. We just want to use this one. So it's okay to leave some of these empty. And same here. I believe we've already got a tile where we draw this, like just this single center box somewhere. So I'm just going to not draw over these ones here, and they just won't get used, which is totally fine. Okay, so I was kind of rambling there. I hope that explanation makes sense, at least enough that you feel comfortable using this on your own. And now you'll see, because we set the icon tile, this this contained wooden, like the one with just a wall on each side, will be our default tile here. And now if I draw, we'll actually see Godot is being smart in knowing which tile to place based on our bit mask. And this works for a whole variety of different options here. And so if I start drawing around, we'll see that it correctly maps out the right tile to use, and it's using that there, which is really, really cool. So all of a sudden, we don't have to place all these manually. Godot is smart enough to know which one to use based on what are like which tiles are surrounding it. So this is really cool, and this is a good step, but there's even more that we can do with tile maps to making a game map and editing and adding collision shapes and all the stuff we need to do even easier and even better. Okay, so now that we have our tiles, or our building auto tiles set up, I'm actually going to erase all the tiles we added here. So within the Godot editor, if you're looking at a scene and you have a tile map selected, you can left click to draw tiles and then right click to delete them. So it's pretty consistent between the tile set editor and actually placing them on your game. Left click to place, right click to remove. Same for bitmask, same for the actual tiles you have here. And one helpful thing is that if you shift click, you can draw straight lines. And if you command shift click, and I'm assuming it's control shift click on Windows, but for Mac it's command shift click, you can draw squares. So I can move this around and draw a square. So it just makes it way easier to draw your tiles. And Godot still uses your auto tiling rules no matter what type of brush you're using. This also works for getting rid of. So if I command shift right click, I can get rid of multiple tiles, within a square. Anyway, so do that. I'll get rid of all these. So I had previously mentioned that we wanted to have separate tile maps for our ground and for our walls, and potentially another one for ground decorations or overlay. So we don't want to have our walls on our ground tile map, but we want them to use the same tile set resource, which our tile set is what has all of the individual tiles defined. So what I'm going to do is hit Command D to duplicate our ground, and I'm going to call this walls or buildings. You can call it whatever you want. And we'll see it still has the same tile set, which is good, because if we edit or add tiles to one of these, we want all of them to be able to use it. One thing we could do is just save this as an actual tile set resource that we could load in, but it's fine to do it just like this for now. So we have our walls set up, and we know that if we draw walls, we will get a building. It's going to look how we need it, and so we're good to go there. But let's actually get our ground set up and our grass and dirt and everything. And in order to do that, we're going to come back into our tile set and talk about the last type of tile that we haven't gotten to yet, which is an atlas tile. So the difference between an auto tile and an atlas tile is that atlas tiles do not automatically draw based on rules that you set, like a bit mask, but you do specify multiple tiles, and you can have it randomly pick which tile to use based on a priority system. So that'll make more sense in just a second when we actually do it. So I'm going to click New Atlas, and I'm going to drag our 4 grass tiles here. So the purpose of this is that we have 4 different grass tiles, and we want to randomly use all 4 of those so that our grass doesn't all look exactly the same. We want it to look unique and have some variance so that it just doesn't visually appear weird. You want it to have some difference between each tile. And so we want to have a way to tell Godot to just automatically choose one of these 4 tiles whenever we put down a grass tile. And so I'll select our Atlas tile here. I'm going to call this grass. And so you'll notice there's no bit mask option for an Atlas tile, but there is a priority option. And so if I click on these, you'll see that each tile within our this Atlas tile we've defined has a 1 out of 4 priority. And Godot automatically generates that. It says it looks at how many tiles are part of your Atlas tile and then evenly distributes the priority for each of those. So what this means right now is that each of these tiles has a 1 out of 4 chance, or a 25% chance of being drawn. And so this means we're going to get pretty much even distribution automatically between all 4 of these tiles. But let's say we wanted this tile to happen most of the time and have all the other tiles appear just kind of randomly. You might do this if you had an empty grass tile that didn't have these little flourishes on it, and you would want that to be the majority, and then every once in a while have little variations or pop-ups. So what we could do is edit this number, and I could say I want this to have a 3 out of 4 percent. So this is going to have a 75% chance of appearing, and the others will have a lower percent. Godot will automatically do the math for you and say, okay, if you bump this up to 3, that means it has a 50% chance of appearing, and all the others are now 1 out of 6. So it's a really neat way to kind of automatically handle which tiles you want to appear in when and what priority. And if I switch that back to 1, you'll see it resets it all. So, a lot of talking, but that's basically Atlas tiles in a nutshell. And there's a lot of other things you can do with all these tiles. We haven't talked about collision, occlusion, navigation. We will get to collision at least today. But there's a couple other benefits of using Atlas tiles. And we'll see that if I come back to our ground here, we will see that if I select an Atlas tile, it actually is going to open up a subtile editor here. So I can just click and paint our Atlas tiles, and you'll still see, even though we define the priority, these are all the same tiles right now. It's like always got this little top one right here, like it's drawing them all the same. What we need to do is actually check this enable priority, and that means that it is going to automatically determine which tiles it's going to draw for us. Now, this is really neat because you can toggle this on or off at any time, and it lets you have manual control over tiles if you need. So say we wanted to just put down a blanket layer of grass that Godot automatically picked for us. But then we wanted to later on go through and do some visual or manual detailing and change it up just to make it look better. Well, we can tick off enable priority and then manually choose which of these 4 tiles to place. So this is a really good way if the automatically generated thing isn't quite looking the way you need it to, that you can go back in and actually edit those automatically generated tiles and put a layer of manual polish over them. So just a really cool thing about how you can do that within Godot. So if I have enable priority checked and I draw this, I right clicked and I draw this, we'll see that it's going to randomly generate tiles. So look at this, we've got only 2 flourishes here, a different 2 here, we've got the big one here. So it automatically generates it, and it just looks better. It just looks good. One thing I'm going to do too is drag our ground to the top of our scene tree so that it appears underneath everything. And now if I open up our game, we'll actually see we have, oh no. Oh, whoops, I'm so dumb. I didn't even realize I did this. I accidentally dragged our ground to be a child of our camera. I meant to just put it in our scene. Oopsie. So anyway, now you'll see we actually have ground to walk on, which is great. It's just a small thing, but it adds a huge just like layer of polish to our game. And so what we're gonna do, just to give our game some extra feel and make it so we're not just walking on the void, this empty gray screen, I'm just going to drag our grass tile on our ground tile map. Make sure this is ground and we're not doing it on walls. I'm just gonna drag it over a big swath of our game. And just to make sure that for the most part, it's going to be really hard for our camera to not be surrounded by grass. We don't have barriers on the edge of our tile map, and placing tile maps does not automatically limit where the player can move. So don't assume that we're getting that for free. But what this means is that just by default, the player is going to have to go out of their way to see a place that isn't grass. So this is nice. We've just made it so our game actually has a background, and we're ready to start adding walls and some other decorations on top of it to make it look even better. Okay, so now that we have our basic tile map functionality here, and now that we've covered the 3 different types of tiles that you can use and when they're good and what they're good for, let's actually start making our tiles be interactive within our game. Let's add some collision. Let's start building out our actual map and make this something really cool. So one quick note I want to say is you might notice if you're using a different tile map that your tiles don't actually cover the entirety of a square here. Just one thing you want to make sure is that your cell size matches your subtile size. So if we have a cell size of 64, that should match whatever our subtile size is here. So you want those two to be the same so that you are always like they're always in step with each other. And again, don't feel like everything needs to be uniform. You know, you have manual control. So if I come through and I want to add props later, but I'm doing it within a tile map, like say I want to add toasters throughout our game, I can select this and choose to like right now it's locked to the grid, but I could potentially change our cell size or take off our like locking to kind of move it around, or I could add an offset to our toasters. So there's a lot of things you can do to give your tile maps not just a rigid grid feel. Another thing I usually do is I don't, even if I have a lot of props I want to add that come in the same tile sheet that I'm using for my tile map, I will do props as separate just sprites or like kinematic bodies or static bodies and not include them in my tile map, just have more fine-grained control over how I can move them around. So just because you have things like props, you know, barricades or like crates or something in your tile map in the same like sprite you're using for your tile map, don't be afraid to use that same sprite just for regular objects like kinematic bodies or static bodies or something like that. So the core point of all that is do what you have to do to make your game your game. You know, there's no right way to use the editor. There's no right way to use Godot, and there's no right way to use tile maps. You need to use it's just tools there at your disposal to use them as you need to. So we've got all 3 types of tiles here, but what we don't have is collision, and we don't really have any decoration. Like it's really nice that we have grass here, but it's kind of boring. And it's kind of bright too. Like it kind of just stands out. So what I want to do now is add 2 things. I want to add some dirt or some other ground tiles that we can use. And I want to add collision shapes to our walls so that we have some obstacles the player and enemies have to move around. Now, with that said, remember that we do not actually have real pathfinding in our game. We just tell our AI units to move in a straight line, and we don't have smart handling for that. So if there's something in the way, they're just going to keep running into the wall and not get around it. So we're currently somewhat limited by our pathfinding ability. So when we design our level layout, we need to make sure a straight path exists from one base to another. So that's something I want to tackle later on if we get time, is to add actual pathfinding. But for now, just keep that in mind, that if you try and add obstacles or things that the player and enemies have to move around, you're going to run into problems because they're just going to run straight into it. Okay, with that said, let's get into adding some dirt. We'll start with that and then do the collisions afterwards. So I'm going to duplicate our ground tile map again, and I'm going to call this ground decorations. Like I said, sometimes I call it overlay. It really just depends, whatever you prefer. And again, we could just do this in our ground tile map and just paint over our grass. I just like having a background tile map that's just one thing, because I think it makes it easier to detail over later on. It's a little bit weird when you have square tiles because it's hard to make transitions between tiles that take up the whole square. And this Kenny tile set we're using is great. It is amazing and it's free, but it doesn't really have good transitions. So like if I add a dirt tile, it's just going to be grass and then dirt. It's going to be like a straight line transition. It's not going to look super good. So when you have a tile set like this where there's not transitions or like intermediary tiles to kind of make it look better, one thing you can do is have a separate tile map that sits on top where you actually have your dirt or your decorations or whatever you want to have. And you can add some like, you know, slightly transparent tiles, or you can modulate them in and out and separate them. You can just do some things to make it look better and give the appearance of kind of fading from one tile type to another, even if you don't actually have those transition tiles. So all that to say, what we're going to do now is come into our tile set, click on our tile sheet. We're going to add a new Atlas tile, and I'm just going to drag this over our dirt tiles here. I'll call this dirt. And that's pretty much all we're going to need to do here. No collision. We don't need to change the priority. Just 1 out of 2 is perfectly fine. And so what I'm going to do is not change our ground tile map, but I'm going to select our dirt tile within our ground decorations. And I'm just going to, for now, I'll just do a straight line. Oh, whoops. I should do a square. And I'm just going to kind of draw this through. And around our bases, I'm just going to draw like a little bit of extra tiling just to make it clear, like, hey, this is our base. And I'll just draw the same thing over here. We'll just draw this. So again, just a little extra polish to kind of make our bases stand out and to give a little bit of variation to our game. Now, this all said, I'm gonna need to move our bases a little bit just to make them line up with this. But at least now, you know, there's a, like we have a path forward. And I'm just going to make it kind of die out here a little bit. And this is where I said, like, you know, you could do something like having a better transition between these. But this is what I meant where the transition from square tiles kind of looks weird. It's just super quick, you know, there's no in between here. So something we could do is try and add some tiles that are modulated, or do something. We could have another tile map that's like transitions. Just thoughts. There's a lot of things you can do. So with that in mind, let's real quick take our bases, capturable base. Let's move this right here. Let's move this right in here just to move these into the middle. And I'll move this into the middle as well. Okay, perfect. So we've got kind of a path right now that our units are going to walk on. Well, this one's a little bit bigger, but not a big deal. And yeah, even though it's a small thing, it still looks a lot better than it previously did. And now it's just like, it's easier to get your bearings because you can kind of see where the dirt is. You can see where the base is. It makes it a little bit easier to see the base because it stands out. So small things, but we are already adding a huge extra layer of polish. And man, we got to figure out, there's definitely a bug causing, oh, that's a bug too, but there's a bug causing our enemies to just run like straight to the last base. So we will figure that out eventually. But anyway, so, but yeah, so I think we've pretty much got it for our ground. And again, just my preference, I like to have just a ground layer that is just straight grass or whatever your base tile is and not change it. And then use ground decorations to actually add the overlay for that. So now we are ready to add collision to our walls. So in order to just demonstrate this, one, let me just select our walls here, and I'm gonna keep our walls near the end of our scene tree because we do want them to get drawn above other things. And there's a couple ways to handle this. There's a Y sort node we can add, which sorts all of its children based on their Y positions. You can also toggle Y sorting within a tile map. So say you're using a tile map to have like trees or something, and they're not drawing on top of each other correctly. You can automatically select the Y sort to have individual tiles drawn on top of each other based on their Y position. So usually if you're doing a top-down game, you don't really need Y sort on for your tile map, but it is a thing you can do. But anyway, so if I'm in our walls tile, actually I'll draw that. I'll move that up here. So if I'm within our walls tile and I start adding a few buildings, so I'm just going to do Command-Shift-Click, building there, building here, building here. Let's make a little extension here. You know, just some buildings that we're adding. And, you know, maybe there's a shed out back. I don't know, something like this. So just adding some buildings. They don't look great. It kind of stands out. They look weird. But just to add something there. Godot is not automatically going to know that we should collide with these. So I can just walk right over them. I can shoot through them. There's just no handling the collision. So we need to fix that. Again, notice that I'm not drawing these within the path of our enemies, just trying to make sure that they don't get lost or stuck on a building. So in order to add collisions, I'm going to come into our tile set, select our tile sheet again, and select our wood building. Now, we could add collisions to our grass and to our dirt and to our toaster, but we definitely don't want to do it for our grass and dirt. There shouldn't be collisions there, but we do want them on our wood building. So if I select our wood building tile, same before how we selected bit masks and priority. That's another thing too, like I'll just real quick mention this. Say we did want to use all these single like tiles. So notice that now we have 4 of these auto tiles that all have the same bit mask. Well, if you see here, like all of these tiles are 1 out of 1 because there's only one tile that matches that bit mask pattern. But if we select here, you'll see 1 out of 4 because Godot has realized, oh, there are 4 tiles that have the same bit mask pattern. So I'm just going to randomly choose out of those 4. But say we almost always wanted it to be the square one and we wanted these to happen, very, very infrequently. We could change this priority here. Now, that's not what we want. I'm going to get rid of these, but just as an example that you can do that. So let's get to collision. And this is one of the more tedious parts of working with tile maps. So I'm probably just going to speed this up, but I'll just show you real quick. So in order to do collision, you have to set it on a per tile basis. And so I can do select create a new rectangle, click this button here. You can also do polygons instead of a rectangle, but I'll just do a rectangle. And I can just select on one of these walls and just click and it will, oh, whoops, that's not what I wanted to do. I was selecting the wrong, there we go. So make sure you select your tile first, your subtile, then I can click this and then just click and it'll automatically draw a rectangle that fills the whole shape. And I can adjust these vertices as needed. They're kind of limited by snap. So you usually want to keep this on. This keeps your polygon inside your tile. But if you turn this off, this will turn off the grid snap so you can adjust these pixel or these the vertices a little bit more fine grained. But for us, it's good enough to just use the rectangle. And here's the thing, we don't actually care what each of these tiles are. Maybe we would eventually want this to be an interior and we would want the player to be able to walk like here. So we would draw our collision shape, something like this. But for now, these are just strictly walls. So we want, whoops, I need to redraw that. We just want this whole thing to collide with the player. We don't want the player to walk anywhere here because this is just a wall. So you'll see if I click out, it'll be shaded yellow as a way of saying, hey, this tile has a collision shape whenever you go into collision. And so what this means is just going through and adding this collision shape to each one. So luckily we just want our standard rectangle collision shape for each tile, but we've got to manually go through that. So I'm going to click on this tile, add a collision shape, click on this tile, click add, and then click on the tile. I'm just going to go through and do this for each of these. So kind of tedious. I wish there was a better way to do it. You can paste in, like there are some fancy things you can do with like pasting collision shapes and pasting bit masks. So for example, like one thing you'll notice is that this like more orangish wood has the exact same tile set or exact same tiles as our wood building here. So say that I had made our collision shape for this entire wood thing, the wood building, I believe there's a way, yeah, you can copy the bit mask, create a new tile here and paste it on. So you can save a lot of time doing that, but I'm not sure there's a way to do that for collision shapes. Oh, whoops, I accidentally made an extra one there. So anyway, all that to say, this is kind of tedious, but it's just something you have to do. So I'm gonna stop this here and just fast forward and finish adding our collision shape to all of these. And then you should just do that on your own as well. And then we'll move on from there. Okay, so went through and added collision shapes to all of our tiles. And you'll notice I did not add them to the tiles we aren't using. So no need to do work that won't matter. And now if I run our game, we will see that the player will collide with these buildings. So we can't go past them, which is awesome. This is exactly what we wanted. And it looks good. And now we have collision. And we could pretty much do this also to add an edge to our map so we could lock the player within a certain area if we wanted to. But yeah, that's pretty much the way we add collision shapes to our game through tile maps. Now, one thing you will notice though is that our bullet can pass through. And the reason for that, if we come into our bullet script, so open up bullet.gd, is we, whenever our bullet enters a physics body, which is happening, so our bullet is colliding per se with our tile map, but because we are only destroying our bullet if that body, that physics body it collides with, has a handle hit method, our bullet's never getting destroyed. It's just passing right through. So I think what we want to do is just, I'll shift tab to move our cube free so that our bullet, whenever it collides with something, it just gets destroyed. Right now, I don't think this is an issue. If we were to add collision shapes to a bunch of other things that we didn't want our bullet to be destroyed on, we'd have to add some extra logic here, but for now it should be good enough. So whenever the bullet actually collides with something, we want it to go away. And because we're using an area 2D for our base, it still won't collide with that. But now if I shoot our building, it just gets destroyed, which is great. This is perfect. It's exactly what we wanted, and we've pretty much got working collisions within our game for our tile map. So this is pretty much like all the major functionality for tile maps, guys. Obviously, there is a lot more we could do. There's a lot of other stuff that would be cool. We could add some other different types of areas, like a little city or a market or a street or something. Tons of options. I might actually do that in a upcoming videos, just spend some time on my own to kind of build out the map, and feel free to do that on your own too. Don't feel like you have to keep your map looking like mine. You can add whatever you want to the game. So if in the next video I've got a different looking tile map, don't be surprised. We'll see if that happens. But otherwise, guys, I think this is pretty much it. If you have any questions about tile maps or other things you think would be cool to cover with tile maps, let me know. And I hope this has been a helpful introduction to tile maps and you feel comfortable and ready to use them in your own game now. So thanks so much, guys, for watching. Always appreciate it. If this was helpful, I'd love if you liked and subscribed to me, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.